this series. So yeah, it's all yours, Monika.
Oh, Monika, you're mute.
I was trying to be good, like mute yourself when you're not talking, so it's hard to unmute. Anyhow, the first 3 chapters of the book is really going over SwiftUI. I have the PDF. So one of the things I like to do as I'm reading is sort of highlight some of the the main points that I find like it's good to sort of go over. One of the things that kind of makes SwiftUI special, that it is a declarative approach to basically telling iOS what to do. And with declarative, as you know, we look at that sort of like the other one. Let's look. The Hello SwiftUI. If you look at like, we've done this Hello world thing in multiple different frameworks, in UI frameworks. But the interesting thing about SwiftUI is that as you kind of look at it, it's almost like reminds you a little bit of HTML, because it's kind of like just, sort of describing what's in the UI with giving, some parameters and specifications, but it's kind of very easy and compact to kind of like look at this and say, oh, okay, so this is kind of what it's doing. There's an image, there's a text field, there's a text. And the other nice thing about, SwiftUI is that as you're sort of adding your declarations here, you can actually see it in the preview mode. And well, as you can see, my preview mode is still, it's not always very fast, So I think Apple's still working on making that very seamless, but it is very, very nice. Like in the old days, you did have like, for those of you who've done UI kit and interface builder, you can see the visual part of your UI. So you were kind of building this thing that we're seeing in the preview, but, you couldn't really interact with it as much. It was just something static, and then you had to run the app, make some modifications, and then go and run it again. And so the beauty of having like, as you're changing things in the code and seeing it near real time updating in the preview is pretty amazing, which I think is what makes SwiftUI so powerful. And kind of going back, so and then the other thing is that the UI is a function of a model state in SwiftUI, and that's kind of interesting to know, because when I first started learning SwiftUI, and I was just doing some tutorials, I found that it was just, different from how I've done things before. So kind of coming back to this, as I'm like typing this, there would be a sort of a delegate for this text field. And as, and then you might, as you're getting, updates to that text field, then you, in your delegate, you get the update, and then you would be updating like the text here where it says hello Monika, and then possibly changing some state of the button. So it was like, you get some changes and then you update things, and the caller is going and making those updates and changing the UI. In SwiftUI, it doesn't kind of work like that. So there's like a state, like my name is a state that is a variable, and when we say like at state, we're kind of telling SwiftUI that this will change. And if you look at like my text, it has like, it's showing name. And then in the text feed, it has this dollar name. So it means that it not only is displaying what I'm typing, but this name can change. And when it changes, basically in the background, iOS, or SwiftUI engine, I should say, is going and basically updating the UI. So I don't do it explicitly. I'm just saying that this text is dependent on this name that can change, and that this text field is capturing this information, this name. And then as it changes, this gets updated. And I think that was like initially a hard concept for me to grasp. I keep going, but I have to go and do something or whatever. And then the burden is just like, somewhere, something, in here, text field is changing name. Somewhere else, you might be depending on something else changing. But once SwiftUI knows that there's a change, it will just go and update the UI for you, and you don't have to do it. And that, in a way, is a lot safer because it just will update when it needs to, and you don't have to go muck around and change things. So I've done a lot of talking. How do folks feel about this kind of concept of basically, that the UI is a function of the model state? Any sort of like, anybody else, if they've played around with SwiftUI, found this to be sort of like kind of different from what they were used to?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are so used to seeing everything as something simple that we can change in the UI.
Yes.
But this makes more sense. And once you get a hang of it, I think it gets much simpler.
Yeah. Once you kind of get used to it, then all the other concepts makes more sense. And let's see. So I had put, and the other thing that we learned in this chapter is that, SwiftUI in the UI kit, there was a lot of work to be able to kind of combine a bunch of views and then make sure that those views are, laid out properly. And, for those of you who use UI kit, you're most familiar with like auto layout. So either programmatically or through storyboard or nib, you're sort of specifying, what the layout of each of the views with respect to others needs to be. And in SwiftUI, it tries to make it a little easier by having there's certain kind of container views. And I have to actually, one thing before that when we speak, when we say view in SwiftUI, it's a little different from when we had like UI views in UI kit. View, which like here text is a view, VStack, a vertical stack is a view, a spacer is a view. These are all, a view is just a description of what's like, what kind of a visual element this is, just a description. And, a VStack itself is more like a container view. So it just sort of specifies, like it contains other views, and it has some attributes for how you want to, lay them out together. So if you have a VStack, it's kind of vertically stacked. If you have an 8 stack, it's horizontally stacked. And you can give some specifications of how they line up. You can give it some modifiers of like, is there padding, spacing between them, how much spacing. So that's another really interesting thing about SwiftUI, because the view is not a particular implementation, it's just a description. And when we see this thing like body sum view, it's basically saying that at the end of this, the resulting sort of UI element is a view, but it's a combination, a composition of other views. And, as long as at the end this, maps to a view, then basically, you're going to have some view and then you can display it. and it has to be at the end one view. So here, like there's a list, it's a container, within it, it has other views. But it's like the result of it is this list with everything else. And that's interesting too. And that kind of enables Apple, when you have something like this that's not really strongly related to a certain sort of a UI framework, then you could write your SwiftUI for both like iPhone, iPad, watch, Mac OS. It doesn't matter, because you're kind of like on this level of coding, you're just kind of describing what these UI elements are, and underneath it there will be a sort of a UI engine that takes these, and it might be using UI kit. So I'm pretty sure that SwiftUI at the end is converting a lot of things to UI kit views that we just don't see. And same goes with watch or Mac OS. But as you writing the app, you don't have to worry about that. And that's also allows it to be kind of multi-platform, which is really nice. Any questions about that? And again, this is kind of like a combined, so I don't want to be the only one talking, just throwing things there. So if we go, so when I guess before we kind of finish with the, for the Hello World, there was a exercise where we wanted to make sure that, oops, sorry, I think I made a mistake. Okay. And that's one funny thing that, if you kind of make a change, I think I just typed something. Can someone figure out what I just backspaced? I think I did. This was enter your thing.
What's the error?
What? Yeah, I'm looking at the error. And that's fine.
Is it the dollar part?
Yeah, and then dollar is correct, but I think when I thought I had my mouse, I had the focus in the entry here, but actually, so maybe is there? I can't change it right now. Does somebody else have this part? Let me see. That looks right. So I must have been accidentally changed. This looks right. This looks right. So what did I inadvertently deleted?
Can you widen the center portion? Yeah, that will be easier to figure out.
Yeah,
Probably it's the parentheses.
it is the parentheses. But the question is, okay, so this one, I think for color, that one was right. This one was right.
Does it need to be a state or something for name?
Oh,
did I? Smart.
nice.
Yeah, it showed that there's a change there.
Yeah, and I don't know. It must have been that the mouse was there. Sort of. There you go. Great. Good job. Anyways, the idea was that, when you have nothing, entered, it just shows you hello. But once I just put Monika, then it actually puts my name there. Because initially it started with like a hello, comma. But it looked weird when you had nothing in there. And then the exercise was, how would you like fix this to make sure that, depending on what the name is, you're either showing hello, comma, name, exclamation, or you're just showing hello. And I did it, because in here, you can have like, a test, if name.count is bigger than 0, then you put hello and name, otherwise, and notice that in Swift, you can actually take your variable and display it by just having this slash with brackets. Anybody else tried this exercise and maybe did it in a different way?
I did mine a little differently. I also did a ternary operator.
Who's this?
This is Julianne.
Oh, cool. Do you want to share your screen? I mean, I can stop and you can show it to us. Let me stop sharing. It's always nice to see what other folks are doing. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing that, you know, there is not necessarily one way to do this. There could be multiple ways. Oh, I guess Julian showed it to us. And so she did the range of character. Yeah, if it is letters, then you have hello. Yeah, it's a perfect way to do it.
So this way, if they put in just numbers or
Oh, something, yeah.
characters, then it wouldn't have the come.
That's great. And even here, you notice that, you know, we're kind of using these container views too. So inside, we have like our image, and then we have the text field and the text and the button. And the button is very interesting too, because, you know, when you like reset, inside these braces is where we do the action, and there's multiple ways you could do that. So the most like succinct way is like, yeah, you have it. There's a closure, and then you just like resetting the name. So when I do that, but you can also kind of, there's like an action parameter, and you can say action close and then put the closure there too. But the interesting part is that there's a initial sort of VStack that, you know, contains just basically these four things. So they're vertically stacked. And then there is another stack on the top that just has a little bit of a padding. Let me just show here. And actually, I had a question that, and I didn't even try that. If I take this out, what happens? And you see that there's just, you know, the text width kind of resizes because now it's going to this outer view is just, you know, the screen, and then resizes to that. So you can kind of get away with one VStack here, but he had it, you know, when we took the code. You had that. And basically the job of these VStack or 8-stack is really kind of laying out your other views. And then for the bookshelf one, you know, it's a little bit more involved, not too much, but, you know, it gives a little bit of a view in terms of like, you know, you actually have this list of books. And if you guys have done UIKit, if we were going to implement this list in UIKit, it actually would be a little bit of a pain. So you would be using a UI table view controller, and then you would have your table view cell. And then basically either you were doing it in the storyboard or programmatic, but it required a lot more code than what we see here. And here, basically, you know, there's this list container where, you know, you take your books, and, you know, it basically takes kind of an array of any element. And then for each of the books, we have a view called book row view, which is basically is what is laying out that specific cell or list view, which is an image. And then the nice thing, and this kind of shows the power of like using these 8-stacks and VStacks, because we have this horizontal stack, and then inside it, then we have like a VStack where we're kind of lining up the labels here, and another 8-stack where we're putting the pages and the ISBN, this part here. Anyone had any issues looking at this and trying to understand how a list or combining these things in a list work? And one of the exercises was, can we update? So he had it that he was just showing 476 the pages. And the exercise was, can we change this to now put like, actual like pages and the ISBN for each book. And it was like a small amount of change for like, adding another 8 stack where we have the pages, and then we have like, the number of the pages, then some label, text, and then, spacer to make sure there's, they're kind of lined up on the left and right. And again, this is one example where I did it this specific way. Let me just open it up so you can see it. Where I had it like, there's a spacer, and then, I kind of bolded the ISBN and put the ISBN number and then the pages there. And I have a feeling others might have done it differently. So anyone else tried this exercise and sort of did it a slightly different way?
Yeah, I did it a little different. I could share my screen.
Sure.
Let me host disabled participant screen sharing. I have no idea how to do it. Then.
Farhana, you need access, right? Just give me a sec.
No
Yeah.
worries.
Yeah, and I noticed, Farhana, that you also forked from his, so that was a good way to do it.
Oh yeah, it saves me so much time to like create the project, rename the project.
That's right.
You should be good now.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let me share Xcode. Okay. So I started with, I did like, I went to the starter part where I just like went through his steps and did everything. For the exercises, I put the text in the H stack, and then I noticed instead of like doing fonts for every single one here,
Yeah.
you could apply it to the whole H
Very
stack.
nice. Yeah.
And that was really cool because I felt like that was just too much code. And one thing that was interesting to me, like when I try to do the left align, the leading trailing parts, I tried this one, multi-align text alignment, and then like leading, and it just wasn't working. It was so weird. So I had to like Google how else to do it, and then someone's like someone's blog said to do this. See, like my trailing here for the ISBN does not do it. So it's interesting, like that doesn't work. I wonder why, but this one works where I did a frame where it takes up the whole width, and then trailing works.
Multi-line text alignment, that works if your text is wrapping around to a next line.
You have just one line of text. It will not.
That's why it doesn't work.
So did you have a different way, Chitra, of doing it, or
Actually, I have learned SwiftUI, so I just breezed through the chapters, didn't go through the
I see. Yeah, no, that's perfectly okay. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's like, and there were a lot of chapters. So although this was like the only 2 exercises. For the other stuff, one of the things that, every time, I mean, that's kind of the beauty of just reading stuff again, and every time you read, something kind of sticks in your head a little bit more. So one thing that I or maybe I didn't notice it before, but this time that I looked at that, Xcode has, because you can imagine that, you start like you do an 8 stack and you start putting all these, views in there, and it kind of gets huge. And in the list thing, with our with basically doing this book row view, there's a lot of stuff here. And initially when you start, you may like start with the list and you start going, okay, what's in that list, that particular list item, and it gets to be kind of huge. And Xcode has this way that you can like highlight and right click, and then it just says extract subview. And then you can extract it into, basically a different view class or struct. And that's like really handy because it allows you like, you can start just like, typing all the stuff, but then you don't want to make the code really hard to read. So that's a good time to refactor and then do this extract subview. So I don't know how many of you guys noticed it, but yeah, it just like, you're just, you go to where your V stack is and, the sort of the outer container. And then when you right click on it, then it just shows you extract subview. And then when you do that, it creates like a default name for that view, and then you can change it. And then there you go. And I thought that's really, really cool. That's like, that's a really nice way to do it. So I suggest anyone who hasn't tried it, try it. It's pretty cool. The other thing that I noticed that kind of going, when I first learned SwiftUI, I was looking at it, I was like, oh, that initial inner view inside the app has to be called content view, because in my head, it's always called content view. When you start with a template, it's content view. And then you realize, oh, no, you don't have to have a named content view. So you can like refactor and rename and change it to, so in the case that, we looked at, it's called the book list view, and that makes more sense than just content view. So I thought that was pretty cool that, you can do that. Anyone else kind of notice that and knew that? So you kind of notice here, you do have, you have that book list view, and that is the main view. It started as content view when you first create your SwiftUI template, but you can refactor and rename it to anything you want, and it'll just change it in all the occurrences. And that's cool because it really makes sense. It is, this particular app is just showing a list of books. So a book list makes sense. And another thing with SwiftUI, we're so used to in UIKit controllers, and you just write another controller, and in SwiftUI you just have these views. So you can navigate from one view to another view, which is again can be a whole layout of other views. And sorry, someone mentioned to me.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh,
Yeah, I was just going to tell you.
yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. And yeah, I also wanted to clarify something with you folks.
Yes. Sure.
So on page 80, sorry, my throat's not good.
Page 18 of the book.
80.
Oh, 80. Okay.
Mhm.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me click on it. It's like sometimes, PDFs are like, don't like to. Yeah, I had it actually highlighted here, and then maybe because that's weird. Let's see, go. It's like, no, I will not let you like do anything with this. Let's see, wait. It's weird. It's kind of like stuck.
So
I'll relaunch it. Do you have it up, or
I'm just gonna paste the paragraph I'm talking about there in the chat.
okay, sure.
So
And while I
yeah.
get that, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So like he was talking about, and I think you were also talking about extracting, subviews and stuff.
Mhm.
So they encourage, creating smaller views, and I was just wondering, like, does that help? Do you think it helps with performance in some way?
I don't necessarily think, well, I don't think it not necessarily helps with performance, but what it does is if you imagine that you're going to potentially reuse some of these views, right? because you know how we start, like we start an app and we start with one, you know, view, and we make these other views in there. And if it was just going to be used in that view, you would think that, you know, it would just, you know, you didn't have to have like specific, you know, view, like, you know, extracting them into separate views. What's the point? But I think at some point you start reusing these views elsewhere too. And then, you know, basically then it becomes very useful. Why repeat the code again? You know, why copy the same, pretty much the same structure somewhere else where you have extracted into its own sort of struct, you know, and then you can use it elsewhere. And then the thing that I think he's really trying to emphasize is that, you know, the way SwiftUI does these things, and, you know, the other thing besides views that we kind of like went over was view modifiers, you know, where we can, like, you know, all that, like adding, like padding, all that. Here's like, this doesn't have as much of a, like a list style plain, it's a modifier on list. And then once that modifier is applied to list changes. But the way SwiftUI kind of does this, that it kind of aggregates through all these modifications and views and creates the final sort of aggregated view, and then just renders that. So if it was that every time you had to render one, then modify something and then go and render another one, then that actually would be very, you know, bad performance. But in this way, you know, views are pretty lightweight. They're just descriptions, as I kind of mentioned. So, you know, it kind of goes through all these descriptions and at the end finds what's the final sort of like aggregated view, and then it goes and renders it. That is not to say there would be some performance, you know, if we were constantly updating something, you know, state changing, so it has to constantly be updating the view, there could be some performance issues with that. But I think this view hierarchy and collapsing it into an efficient data structure that it says, that's something that, you know, we can trust it that it will put it all together efficiently. But for ourselves, it's nice. Like if I have this book row view, then I can be using it in multiple places in my app. And then if I have any special logic or any kind of special thing, then I don't have to repeat myself again. And that's why it's really nice instead of some monolith, you know, giant view that then if I want to slightly do something different, then I have to like copy the entire thing and do it again. Does that kind of make sense? And you know, I'm not the only expert here. So you guys, anyone else has a comment too, that would be good. And then, yeah, so you basically saw this. Yeah, view are just descriptions of the UI. Yeah, and this is the whole declarative approach. That it's hard for us when we're kind of doing it. It's like, oh, like, you know, doesn't make sense to be, because we think it's so heavy, like, you know, it's heavyweight to be like actually, you know, defining and, you know, like classes, you know, it would be, you know, creating classes and managing them is kind of heavy for the operating system. But in this case, these are just like, you know, there's a pretty efficient way to take all these declarations and convert it underneath to a specific, you know, a UI component that actually gets rendered.
Yeah,
Any other questions about that? Yeah, I just saw, yeah, and then there was this thing too that I saw that SwiftUI, you know, so again, the interface declares views in a hierarchy that mirrors the desired layout of your interface. And I think that's kind of the beauty of SwiftUI, that you look at it and you can see the hierarchy. There's a list, and then there's a label, and there's a, you know, H stack with these, you could just grasp what's being about, going to be rendered. And then SwiftUI then manages drawing and updating these views in response to events like state changes and user input. So as you're typing into your text field, it will update it. If the state of the name changes or the book gets, we search for a book and now we have a new list of books, it will just change. And you don't have to, as long as you say my, view is dependent on this, state, then once the state changes, once the list of books changes, it will just re-render. And it only will do it then, rather than you kind of figuring out when you need to do it. So I think that's really powerful. And that's kind of what reactive programming is, that it is in other platforms too. But I think SwiftUI does it pretty, in a very elegant, simple way. I used RxSwift in another project a long time ago, and it was more painful and not so seamless, because it wasn't kind of integrated into, trying to do UI kit in a reactive way was sort of painful and ugly. So it really made sense for Apple to come up with a whole new framework to make this easy to do. And then another sort of like this thing about modifiers. So by calling a modifier on a view, the modifier will create a new view that wraps the original view and replaces it in the view hierarchy. And that's kind of an interesting thing too. I mean, you just see, okay, here's a modifier, like I'm changing the foreground color, and then I'm adding this font, but it's actually underneath, SwiftUI is basically creating this kind of like a modified content that now like it incorporates those modifications into it and sort of a new kind of a midway description that at the end, once all the modifications are, applied, then it's going to render that view. It has that final, it's not like, oh, I'm going to have a text. I'm going to first render the text, then I'm going to update the foreground and re-render the text. Then I'm going to apply the font and re-render the text. If it tried to do that, it would be pretty slow. So it doesn't do that. It just kind of aggregates through all those modifiers, and then you have that final description of your view that it's going to render. And another interesting thing was that the order of the modifications do matter. And I think there was an example here said if you change the ordering of if you're doing foreground color or font, here it was doing like, here's a text and you have a background and you have a padding. And then in the other one, you have a padding and then the background. And if you look at the resulting views, those look totally different. And why? Because in the first one, you had your text and it just changed the background. So it's just the background here, hello world, it's red. And then it added the padding. So then we see this padding around. While in the other one, it did the padding. So now you have the padding around hello world and then change the background. And it's important to kind of know that when you're actually doing your own apps, because you have to kind of know what your intention is for how you want that UI to look and what exactly is, what kind of modifications you're making. But it's really nice. It's kind of like this chaining of modifiers. And again, in terms of readability, it's so nice to, and it just also doesn't make the view really huge, so that, you're not, you don't have the view and you're adding all these things in the constructor and, it just gets kind of unwieldy. These adding the modifications makes it a lot, easier to just define the view and then do the appropriate changes. Or any questions about modifiers? Anyone kind of stuck on them? Okay. And then, again, I'm sort of going through, and then there was this thing that I mentioned about the button that, the button has like a text that, it's displaying, the label of the button, and then there's the action, when you tap on the button. And, again, and it's always good to remind yourself, like, yeah, with Swift, when you have like the last parameter is just the closure, then you can kind of get rid of that whole parameter name. And then it simplifies a lot. And then it's kind of like, oh, okay. So this, whatever happens in these braces is what's kind of the action when you're tapping on the button. Yeah, and then this is again, it's like keeps, SwiftUI is different from many other UI toolkits you might have worked with. You cannot manipulate the UI views directly. Any changes you see on the screen are determined by the state of the application's data model and its transitions. So, it's kind of the big idea. And that's why later when we are going to do this asynchronous stuff with Combine, then you can see the power of this, because, if your data model changes, you're retrieving something from a web, from an API or whatever, before in UIKit, it was kind of a painful thing. You go and retrieve it, then you have to either, people sometimes, in their controllers, get the callback and update all the appropriate elements. And how about if you forgot to update something in SwiftUI, that is a lot easier because you already specified how each UI, each view is dependent on this data. So if that data changes, the view will just change. SwiftUI will update it. And that's, I think, really, really powerful. And then here's the other interesting thing that I saw, that these SwiftUI manages the state of the UI for you in a memory area that only SwiftUI has control over. So you can sort of go and try to manipulate it or whatever. That state, that's something that it's its own logic and it will do those things. So all you have to just basically specify that, that you have some dependency. There is this thing, and you're either observing some other state or whatever, and then it just does that change. Okay. Now, there was this whole going over the state object, state. Anyone has questions about this, of the different ways we can define different, basically when you're binding our object to some other, when in your view, it has a dependency on another object, and how we define that dependency. Does anyone have questions about, what's the difference between a state object, observed object, and environment object? And if you have done some SwiftUI work, which one have you used the most? Or does it make sense when you should use these different ones? And there's also add state, but add state is when you're just defining it right in that view, and then it, add a state object is for an actual class object that can change, that it's not like a struct that is value.
I have used them, but before that, we were supposed to read just the first 3 chapters, right? Was this?
I think this is still, I think this is still in that chapter. Let me see.
This is chapter 4.
Right. Let's look. What's the best way to table of contents? Yeah. So the first, oh my goodness, you're right. Oh, this is perfect. Okay. I got ahead of myself. I started going and everybody's going, yeah, okay. Sorry. I know we're gonna in the next 3 chapters, and these are good ones anyways. Actually, I had a question, since we're getting close to the end. First of all, any questions about these 3 chapters that we went over? Anything that anyone's kind of like, uncertain about? Because this is a perfect venue. Don't feel shy. Anything that you're sort of confused? Probably some of us are confused about it too. So,
I
I
haven't.
don't have- Oh,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead. No, go
No,
ahead.
it was not a question, but just a comment.
sure.
In one of the exercises, you were checking the count of the string, right, to see the length.
Yeah.
A few days back, I was reading the documentation. Apple says that if you use count to see if a string is empty or not, then
Okay.
it's a very taxing process
Oh,
because
okay.
the string is made of Unicode characters, right? So it has to string through to figure out how many characters are in the string. Instead, Apple suggests that you can use is empty.
Yes. Very.
Yeah.
Yes. That's
So
right.
that is when it's not as taxing as counting the characters.
No, that's a perfect, yes, you're quite right. Yeah, because it is really going through, and yeah, obviously if the count is 0, it is, but there's a much better way. And always, like, if there's a method that they already provide to, that they've optimized that, better to use that. No, great point. I will go and change that exercise and push it on our source control. Great point. Anything else?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I kind of get the whole thing around. I think I get the thing around some view and like how it's not a view, but I'm not sure if I understand the usage of the word description. Maybe that's a nitpick for me. I don't know, but it's
No. It's
Yeah.
so I guess when I think about it, I sort of go back to when some of us have done like HTML, right? If you look at HTML, like it's like kind of descriptions of UI elements, right? Because we kind of, and it's like in an XML format, but so it's a little different from here, but it's just kind of describing how a web page, what's in a web page, what are the are you having them in a table, whatever, but it's just how it actually, that description, that HTML gets parsed by your browser and then finally is displayed in an actual web page is something that happens like underneath, right? There's not a specific set of classes like view classes or whatever that you use in the HTML page to define, right? And I think SwiftUI being a declarative thing is similar to that you're sort of saying what should be in this view, like what are all the elements, but then there's kind of like this, it's just the description. There is the engine that takes those descriptions and will map it. And that's what I was kind of saying, like if it's like iPhone and iOS, it will map it to some UIKit class. While before, when we were using UIKit, it's kind of, we're actually in our code specifying the specific like UI view class. Here's my, UI text field, and here's like, I'm adding it to this other view. And so it's an actual, like, it still will go through through an engine that takes that and actually lays it out, into the screen and does all that, but it's closer to what its actual representation is, right? While in SwiftUI, it's just, it's almost like, it's just like a text description. And, that's why, like, if you run this on Mac OS, it will have a different set of classes, view classes that it will map to actually render your app. Or if it's in Watch, I don't know if any of you guys have done Watch development. It's so different from UIKit. It's like, there's no way you can like reuse your code. It's a whole different framework, different named classes. And so it's very hard to write one app that could potentially, can be run on a watch and on a phone. It just, you couldn't do it. But with SwiftUI, you're just saying, show a text, here's the color, here's the title, and, that, and then, the SwiftUI engine, depending on if it's, spurting out code for watch or Mac OS, will convert it to the right kind of view, and then gets changed to the right thing. So I think that's, and because we're so used to, like, whether we're doing Android or we're doing, iOS, we're used to writing in the actual view classes, right? And here, a view is just a description. It's just saying, oh, I'm a text, and there's different descriptions, I'm a text and I'm going to display hello world. But exactly how this text, looks like, what it does, that, I mean, you have some control over it, but it's, it's not actual like view code at that point. And if anyone else also has like a way that it makes sense for them, what a description is, it will be good, because that's kind of how I try to explain it to myself, but,
Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
But, and maybe that's what makes this so, so succinct and, compact, is because of that. Because if we truly had to write, if there weren't just descriptions and we had to write actual like view classes, then you really get the code that we usually have when we do our usual iOS app.
When
Okay.
I was learning SwiftUI, the way I understood views was like this. SwiftUI views. It's like going to a restaurant and placing an order. So you
Okay.
just place an order, you don't go to the kitchen and make your dish.
Very nice description. That's excellent. That's great. Yeah, that's exactly like, you're just kind of giving, I want spaghetti, this ingredient, but you're not actually going and, putting the spaghetti together and, and yeah, that's really, really good description. So for next week, is everyone good with doing the next 3 chapters, or should we kind of divide them up? What's kind of should we do a poll, or?
I'll create a poll.
Next 3,
How about, I mean, for me, I'm like, how about we meet in 2 weeks and then cover these, because it's gonna get a little heavier than the first 3.
Yeah. So I would say let's, because that state management is a big one. So maybe next week we could do state management, and the week after we can do the chapter 5 and 6. And chapter 5 and 6, the way I see it, so I have to kind of be a little ahead just to make sure that we're kind of, there's a lot of content there, but we don't have to know everything about list or input forms to then continue on to combine and stuff. So I kind of feel like he's just putting in there because he's going to use examples of it later on in the book. And we can always refer to it, but state management is an important concept, because as we're going to learn, that's, so let's do chapter 4 for next week. And then chapter 5 and 6 for the week after. And then we're kind of ready to push on combined. And as you guys, whoever, if you already like, you have plenty of time, more than welcome to, go a little ahead, read the chapters, and then maybe even reread a couple of times, because sometimes I read and I'm like, oh, I missed this, but for next week, let's focus on chapter 4, if that's good with everyone.
Yeah, and if you're joining us from a very different time zone, just keep in mind that the daylight saving is gonna take place when you convert it. Yeah.
Unfortunately. Well, I don't know. I think it's sometimes better this way than the other way, when we're gonna lose the, All right. So it was so nice to do this session with everyone, and take care till next week.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, folks, and thank you so much, Monika.
Yeah.
This was great.
Bye.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.